When I started hanging out with coaches and being coached myself, it struck me that the humane quality of the interaction, its warmth and rapport, is so important. And for coaching to work, we need a great chemistry between the coach and their client. But then, when I trained as a coach, I was hit with this out-of-place word. A word that, to me, is quite odd. It's quite cold and actually a bit scary and off-putting. That daunting word is the word contracting. Hello, and a warm welcome to this podcast on the business of coaching. I'm Hugh Reynolds, Head of Digital at Management Futures, and I thought it would be a great idea to record some informal, insightful, and candid conversations with my colleagues, associates, and friends. Now, these people are all great practitioners, and they've got lots of insightful experience to share, but I really just wanted to find an excuse to spend more time with them, whilst producing discussions that might spark further thinking and debate in our learning community. If you're new to Management Futures and what we get up to, I'll just mention that our work is about enabling leaders and teams, organisations and coaches, and that coaching is always at the very heart of what we do. And at the heart of coaching, at least at the start of every effective coaching relationship, there is this thing we do called contracting. We establish a contract. Now somehow I want to come to terms with this troublesome term contract, so I called up my main man Tony Betts, because he's a top coach and he has a lifetime of really varied international business experience. He's not only agreed a good few contracts in his time, as with everything Tony turns his hand and mind to, he thinks deeply about the nature and necessity of contracting. I really hope you enjoy the chat. Thanks so much for talking to me about this, Tony, and having this conversation. I wondered if we could contract for the conversation, given what we're going to be talking about today. How would you go about contracting a conversation? Say we're going to have a chat like this. What sort of things would you do for contracting a conversation?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I suppose in that question lies the answer to the bigger question about contracting. And so my first question would be, what are your expectations? What would you like to get out of our time today?
Yeah, so expectation-wise, I'm thinking the time would be about 20 minutes, if that's okay with you. I'm a little bit anxious about keeping to that time because I know I waffle a lot, and particularly with friends and particularly with people who are so interesting to talk to. So yeah, 20 minutes, and having some content in our conversation about a contract and what it is to contract, how that plays into our role as coaches, particularly, and how it might sometimes get in the way of coaching. So I'd just like to have a chat about contracting, really, Tony, in the next 20 minutes. Is that good enough as a contract?
Sounds a good place to start, Hugh. So a little bit of content about contracting in general, contracting specifics, some bits and pieces about things perhaps that are not obvious. Perhaps the less obvious might be useful to perhaps touch on and try to get something in the can, as it were, within 20 minutes. That sounds about right here.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for making that contract. It was so easy. I wouldn't normally call it a contract. So perhaps that speaks to this idea of the less obvious contracts that we could have. Let me ask you a question to kick us off then, Tony. What, to your mind, is a contract?
Hey, that's a good question. I mean, at its least formal, as we have now, it's an agreement between parties as to what the general expectations are about the time or the energy or the service that you're going to provide. I think, and it is, if you look at it in its simplest form, I think it's really helpful to just say, what are these people that I'm talking with? What are they actually expecting? How are they going to measure it? If I'm clear about what their expectations are, then I know pretty much what I've got to provide, I would also know how to add value if I wanted to.
Doesn't it get in the way of the service though sometimes? Because it sounds quite a scary word to me sometimes. When I have to sign something when I start a new job, or when I'm working on a new project and I have to sign something, or explicitly state what my expectations are. Um, it feels a bit restrictive to me. So are there some downsides to it as well?
I think it can be, obviously, when you're contracting as a supplier to, a big organization that have a buying department, a purchasing department, and they insist on all manner of minimum standards for their suppliers, that can feel a bit onerous, especially now with the new ESG. But most of the kind of conversations that one has as a coach are really just making sure that what does this person really expect? Um, and that is, in part, it's explicit. And a simple contract that you can send to somebody, which just outlines the fact that coaching is not advice, I think is probably
Mm.
the most critical part, as you well know. Because the moment that you say you're giving people advice, then you're now putting yourself in the role of professional advisor, which then means that should a person not achieve what they think that they are going to get out of it, then you're opening yourself up to potential problems. So it is useful, not in a heavy handed sort of way, but just in a light touch. What's your experience with coaching? If our time together is to be spent well, what would you expect out of it? How will you measure that? And who are the other interested parties? Is there a sponsor involved? Are there stakeholders? Um, is HR involved? Is a line manager involved? Or is this something that you're doing for yourself? It's these kind of conversations. You can keep it pretty light, but it's important to have that conversation.
And that contract, I can see how it could be formed between, say, a coach and a coachee. But you're mentioning these other stakeholders, wider stakeholders that you might have to contract with as well. So are we talking about one Uber document, one overarching contract, or is it something a bit more nuanced than that, or sort of more plural, that there might be lots of contracts that you're making, informal, more formal, explicit, more implicit? How is it when you're going into a company and starting to work as a coach then?
Yeah, see, I think you've summarized it very well there, Hugh. I don't know if there would be one Uber contract. I think that there would certainly be one written contract, which would certainly be with the people who are about to pay you. That may well be purchasing department or the finance department or HR department along with the finance department normally. And so there is some paperwork. If you're planning to get paid by a big corporation, especially if you're working globally, um, you want to make sure that there is one document that is absolutely clear as to what you're going to provide, and making sure that you have all of the pieces in place to end up getting paid. Otherwise, you won't get paid.
Hmm. And in
So,
terms of your coaching, though, Tony, how does it fit with the style of being a coach? Because as we might be touching on here, sometimes it can seem at odds with coaching, or something that is beyond the coaching room, perhaps. So how does it tie in with your practice as a coach?
as a coach, I mean, Hugh, you know this well, man. As a coach, you one of the roles of a coach is to meet people where they're at. So whoever you're speaking with, if you're speaking to finance, you're talking to them in finance terms. Speaking to HR, you're talking to them in terms of HR terms. And when you're finally talking to your client, you're talking to your client as somebody that hopefully you're going to have a conversation which is often quite deep, requires a great deal of trust on the other person's behalf to disclose to you in full things that they may be feel that they can't discuss with somebody else. So in that conversation, it's it would be an absolute turn-off, in my view, to even touch on the finance or the contractual or the formal side. I think that would be a major turn-off, personally.
Mm-hmm.
But just with your client, you meet, you sometimes have these compatibility conversations, or as they sometimes call chemistry conversations, um, in which you create that kind of uh, the atmosphere, the climate in which you hope that that person's going to trust you based on your voice alone, or if they see you visually on a video, or if you're meeting face to face, where they think to themselves, yeah, this person is somebody that I can confidently discuss and perhaps even disclose things people quite often talk about: their line manager, the organization, or the fact that they're even thinking of shifting an organization. And they're not going to do this if they feel that you are just simply an extension of HR, or you're the person that's been assigned by the company to fix them, or to whip them into line or into shape. So there is a lot to understanding what's everybody's expectation here.
And it sounds like you're working in different registers or different modes. So when you're talking to finance or HR, you're in one mode, you're using certain language, or you're using a certain approach. And then when it comes to the coaching client and doing the coaching proper, if you like, there has to be a deeper quality of relationship, a deeper quality of interaction there. Because I'm just challenging something here, Tony, because something I heard recently, and it may have even been you that said this, was that you never stop coaching. That as a coach, you're bringing to the fore those skills into all those different interactions. But what do you make of that? And again, it's only my interpretation of what you're saying here, Tony. So I might have missed it by a long shot. But there's different styles of communication that you're using along the journey to get some work and do it and get paid for it.
Well, I think you said it correctly there, Hugh, that you're always coaching. And I think you are always coaching. And I think fundamental to good coaching is being able to put yourself into the other person's shoes, and to understand the world that they're in and meet them in their world, rather than trying to drag them into your world. So, for example, you're talking to an HR person. HR traditionally in organizations haven't always had, if you like, the dominant power in the boardroom. They're seen quite often as kind of a very necessary and useful person, but they don't necessarily have the, hesitating to use the word, but the sort of authority that the CFO or the CIO or somebody might have.
Mm-hmm.
And so consequently, you need to understand when you're talking to HR and you say, well, almost, how are things going for you? How, what are your goals within the organization? And how is HR seen? And where are you going? So you're almost having a conversation with the person. In an ideal world, where do you see coaching sitting within your HR function in the next year? Those kind of questions will tell you pretty much how secure or maybe how insecure that person is. Because what you need to know as the coach is ultimately who's going to make a judgment on whether the coaching was successful or not. What was the criteria? If you may be contracted for 10 sessions or 6 sessions or whatever it might be, at the end of that time, somebody's going to say, did we spend our money wisely? Who is that person that's going to ask that question? And on what basis are they going to judge it? Is it going to be purely subjective? What is it? And I think that, if you want to be a professional coach, you really do need to think about that. And I'm sure that all professional coaches do that. Or shall we say most professional coaches would consider, well, who's going to make a judgment here? Is it just, going to be left subjectively? I mean, these days there's more and more three-way conversations. There's four-way conversations. There's three-way conversations with the stakeholder, or ostensibly as a line manager or a chief exec or somebody. Sometimes it includes the the HR department as well. And you really got to listen to, what's everybody's expectation here and how are they going to judge it. It doesn't necessarily inform or change the manner in which you're going to be coaching your client when you get into the one-on-one situation. But certainly if you find it gives you, if you like, the parameters in which the coaching conversation is going to take place. So whilst you may well give leeway to a person in the allowing them to talk about their, all of the things that are going on in their life, not necessarily at work, because you know that these may well be impacting the work situation.
Mm-hmm.
But at a certain point, you're going to be saying, so how would this play into, what do you think HR's expectations are? What do you think your line manager's expectations are here? What do you think the chief executive, whoever the main sponsor is, what do you think their expectations of us having a conversation are? And so how do we negotiate that? How do we manage that? What kind of outcomes are we looking at? And this kind of brings it back into the area of, okay, somebody's paying for this. How do we make sure that everybody's getting their money's worth, their return on the money and time invested?
And it sounds a really complicated picture, or complex picture actually, Tony, and one that maybe we don't touch on so much in coaching training and coach skills training, because we're focused so much on the contract with the individual, perhaps, or then separately arrangements with the organization, but maybe not putting those pieces together. And I think it's hugely valuable to hear your perspective on this, Tony, is what happens in the real world when you go out with a mission to coach and try to do it in the raw or in the field, if you like. I'm really taken that you've used the word listen so much there, that it's all about listening to those different stakeholders and also dealing with their perhaps sometimes conflicting expectations. Hi, how's it going so far? You're listening to a podcast on the business of coaching from Management Futures. I'm Hugh Reynolds, and my conversational partner is top international coach and consultant Tony Betts. Tony and I are in the middle of a chat about what contracting is and why we really need to pay attention to doing it well. Thanks for listening in. Can I ask a question about openness, Tony? Because how much each of these stakeholders knows about those other conversations. You touched on it before, that you might not bring the same language into a coaching conversation as one that you have about how much to get paid for a gig, if you like. But to what extent is it important that we all know everything about what's going on in this process?
When you say we all,
the whole network, the whole cast of players in this process that enables you to go in as a coach and to do your coaching work. And that's not just interacting with the recipient of your coaching, or the coachee, that's involving these stakeholders as well. So is it an open process, or is it a bit more separated?
That's a really, you've touched on a very difficult point there, because it is separate. And if the expectation of HR or the CEO is that you are going to feed back how well the coachee is doing, that's a red flag for me, because then the implication is, well, why are you sending this person for coaching? Are they in fact underperforming and you're dressing it up as a reward kind of thing? So it's a bit of a red flag. And so I'm always very explicit, and I say, so what is your expectation in terms of feedback? I have to point out that as a coach, the content of the conversation is absolutely confidential. Certainly, if you're looking for feedback on the topics that we want, that you would like us to discuss, it's, about maybe team building or whatever it might be, we can say, yes, we've discussed this topic, but if you want to know any of the content, you're going to have to go back to your coachee. As coach, I can't give you that. So as long as we understand that from the outset. So that's also another contract, you know. Yeah.
They're everywhere, Tony, aren't they? Once we start talking about them and looking around.
Unfortunately, yes. Life is a contract.
Yeah, it seems to be. Tony, I'm going to ask one very broad question, which is unfair, really, to ask you this at the end of our time together. But I just wanted to give you an opportunity to reflect on your own experience with contracts, good and bad, throughout your career. What stands out to you as some examples of good practice or bad practice or just interesting practice that we could hear about?
Wow, Hugh, you're right. That's a bloody curveball to throw in at the end, man. Yeah. Look, the comments that I've made today are based on more than 20 years of contracting, internationally. A lot of clients come to me directly, and large financial institutions, major organizations have contracted with me directly with no one in between. So I've had to learn the hard way, if you like, the to manage everybody, to be very clear on what expectations there are. And frankly, without sounding too mercenary, that I'm not in it for altruism. I do devote some time on pro bono work, but that's pro bono work. If I'm working for a large bank or a large organization, I expect to be paid, and I expect to understand what the basis of that payment is going to be, and or if there were a dispute, exactly, how I would avoid that. So it's on practical experience that, and I'm not going to, actually, I don't think I've ever, touch wood, fallen foul of it, because I've understood this from my days in advertising. They very quickly, there was a well-known adage in advertising years ago: 50% of all advertising is wasted. The only thing is nobody knows which 50%. So if you want to get the advertising contract renewed the next year, you better make sure that you understand which 50% you're going to be judged on. So that was, if you like, I came to coaching with that kind of practical commercial experience. And so, and the only time in terms of one-on-one with coachees where I think that I could have done better, if you like, is when I thought that I had contracted very clearly that it wasn't about advice, and it wasn't about this, and it wasn't about the other, and so on, all of the normal things that which we learn in the great course that is run. But sometimes somebody gets past that and they don't hear it. You can say it quite explicitly, but they don't want to hear that. What they are actually looking for is somebody to tell them what to do. They may spot in your, your biography or something that you've had some kind of industry experience, which they feel they want to tap into. And that's a danger signal, because now you are then you have to recontract and say, are you asking me this as a person who was in that business? Are you asking me for an opinion as a consultant now? Because if so, then that's a different conversation that we're having. I don't mind giving you my personal experience in advertising, marketing, whatever it is that I may have had that may have attracted somebody to come to me. But I recontract right at that moment and make sure that if you're asking me my personal opinion, it's this. But let's get back to, what are you going to do with that information? If I give you that information, what are you going to do with it?
Thank you, Tony. And I think that's a good place to end, really, in breaking contracts and remaking them. And it sort of addresses a question that I would have asked had we had more time, about whether a contract is a fixed thing, and when you go back to it. And you've just given us a great example of where you had to step out and then recontract before progressing. So thanks so much, Tony. And also on that theme of not giving advice, I think something that I've really got from this conversation, as for all our other chats, Tony, is that we're all coaching in a different contexts and different setups and scenarios, But this contracting issue crops up, and to air it with somebody like your good self and have an open conversation has really helped me think about it in a different way, even though my context is very different. And I'm not going to come back and sort of hit you with any advice that you've given today. I just want to reflect on process, really, of agreeing and finding out expectations at the outset and during the process to make coaching a more beneficial and fruitful experience for everyone. So that's a long-winded way of saying thanks ever so much, Tony. It was great chatting with you.
Absolute pleasure, Hugh. And we've touched on what is a really big topic, and you've asked some really great questions. So I hope whoever ends up listening to this finds some value, or at least prompts them to shine a light into the dark corners and avoid any hassles. And just to finish off, I would say that touch wood again, that because of this kind of if you like, a more holistic view of looking at all the different potential pitfalls and making sure you understand who all the players are and what their expectations are. I have to say that so far in 20 plus years, I've managed to not have anybody come back and ask for their money back. So I think it's been worthwhile to pay a bit more attention to everybody's contracts.
Thank you, Tony. That's really illuminating, and there's hope for us all in this coaching game. Let's go out there and make some great contracts. Thanks ever so much, Tony. See you next time.
Great, Hugh. Cheers, man. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Tony Betts for all his time and thought on this topic. This isn't the final word on contracting or anything else. It's just a chat we felt you might like to listen in on. But we really hope you've got something from our discussion. Do check us out and what we're up to. Online we live at managementfutures.co.uk. I'm Hugh Reynolds with the privilege of producing digital projects for MF, and I'd love to hear from you if you'd like to suggest topics for future conversations around coaching, teams, high performance, inclusion, or any other shared interest. See you soon. Take care.